Voting in Philadelphia from the colonial period to 1900 has been kind of a nightmare. We recognize some of the voting traditions on Election Day, but they look very different. Election Day was lively, for sure, but the threat of violence was always there, too. For much of this period, voting was only safe for certain white men. That started to change after the Civil War, when Black men won the right to vote. But let's not forget that Black men died on the streets of Philly trying to exercise that right. And women in Philadelphia still couldn't vote in 1900. Why didn't somebody do something? Well, reformers were pushing for change, for an end to corruption, for a safer election day. They sort of got what they wanted, but these changes had some unintended consequences. This is Found in Philadelphia, a podcast dedicated to telling the stories of Philadelphia's past so that we can better understand the present, because our history matters. I'm your host, Lori Ament. With each episode, I hope that you'll learn something new, see things a little differently, and be inspired to go discover some of this history for yourself, right here in the city of brotherly love. This episode is the last in a 4-part series about Election Day and the streets of Philadelphia. In this episode, we'll look at how Election Day transformed in the 20th century. We'll see how voting came to look like it does today, an event that doesn't necessarily always happen in the street. I want to dedicate this episode to all of you. Thank you so much for listening to this series. If you can, I hope that you will go vote this November, maybe with a new appreciation for your role in this ongoing civic ritual. Throughout this series, we've been hearing from Professor Mark Bruen, Associate Professor of Media Studies at the University of Tulsa and author of the 2008 book, Celebrating Democracy, The Mass-Mediated Ritual of Election Day. Professor Bruen will continue as our guide to Election Day throughout Philadelphia's history. In the last episode, we witnessed Black men win back the right to vote after the Civil War. And then we trudged through murder, voter intimidation, and open corruption on Election Day in Gilded Age Philadelphia. This brings us up to around 1900, maybe a little before. We briefly mentioned the reform movement in the last episode, but they're important to our history of Election Day in Philly. So now, let's talk about the reform movement. In the 1890s, there was a growing call for reform to root out corruption in politics and stop voter fraud on Election Day. The reformers tended to come from the wealthy and better off in the middle class. They wanted to clean up government, and they remained suspicious of political parties in general. They didn't like the kind of corrupt government that the party machines created. Reformers never truly coalesced around a single party. They tried on different names in Philadelphia: the City Party, the Keystone Party, or the Franklin Party. The opposition gave them different names: the Mugwumps or the Young Scratchers. The reformers read newspapers like the North American and the Public Ledger, which glorified the independent voter as a hero voting for the common good. The independent voter didn't vote the partisan party ticket. Remember, in this period, a voter's ballot was a piece of paper that had been printed by one of the political parties on Election Day. So if you were a Republican, you'd go to the polls on Election Day, find the Republican ticket captain, get your party ticket listing all your candidates, and then you handed in that partisan printed ticket as your official ballot. But the reform-minded, independent voter was trying to do something different. Professor Bruen explains.
There's no such thing as a nonpartisan ballot. There are records of people who would write up their own tickets at home and vote those tickets when they went to the polls. They wouldn't go to the party booth. But that doesn't seem to have been a very common occurrence, frankly.
Just to be clear, the political reformers of this era were not trying to make a more inclusive democracy. They had an axe to grind. Many reformers believed that they should be the leaders in Philadelphia, not those corrupt political bosses, many of whom were working class. Reformers tended to be fairly wealthy. They attended the best schools, they were well connected socially, and they felt like the party bosses denied them elected office with their tricks, intimidation, and outright fraud. The social elite had been ousted by a bunch of street brawlers. And these reformers didn't like the look of the voting public. They thought the right to vote was a sacred duty for the citizen. It shouldn't be shared with just anyone. They didn't believe that the ignorant, the illiterate, or the immigrant should vote. Reformers wanted to restrict the right to vote to those they deemed worthy. Some reformers were in favor of things like literacy tests for voters, though these policies were never implemented in Pennsylvania. Reform candidates just didn't do very well in Philadelphia. But reformers did fundamentally transform Election Day. And one of their biggest reforms remains with us today, the Australian ballot. If you've ever voted, you've basically cast your vote using the Australian ballot method. We all have. This innovation began with several states in Australia in the 1850s. On Election Day, the political machines no longer printed their party tickets. In their place, the state printed a single uniform ticket that listed every eligible candidate up for election. And this single ticket was presented to every voter at the polls that day. In addition, voters no longer walked up to an open polling place. Instead, each voter now took this uniform, state-printed ticket into a location that was shielded behind a screen or a divider. They marked the ticket with the candidates they wanted to vote for and cast their ballot in secret. No more public presentation of your ballot. No one needed to know your vote. Not the party boss, not your own boss. No one. This new form of voting was first used in Louisville, Kentucky in 1889, where it replaced a long tradition of voters shouting out their votes on Election Day. By 1910, Pennsylvania joined the majority of states in voting by the Australian ballot method. Proponents of the Australian ballot came from different sides. The upper classes advocated for the secret ballot because they thought it would reduce voter fraud and break the control of the party bosses. Organized labor and others thought that the secret ballot would end voter intimidation by employers and increase workers' independence and engagement in the political system. Everyone hoped that it would reduce violence on Election Day. But Professor Bruin explains that it didn't end the power of the political machine in Philadelphia.
So if we think about the switch from the party ballot to the state-printed ballot, which is pretty important because once you're going into a booth with a ballot that has both parties or sometimes 3 or 4 parties printed on the ballot, and you're behind this, a secret booth, then you have a true secret choice. And that's problematic from the viewpoint of the party because they'd like to be able to make sure that you're voting the right way. The secret ballot makes that difficult. Not impossible, but difficult. And so that's a pretty important reform, but it doesn't really destroy the power of the machine. The machine has other ways to sort of continue its power.
But the Australian ballot system was somewhat successful in decreasing the levels of violence on Election Day, though violence has never completely gone away. With the state printing the ballots, you no longer needed ticket captains pushing their party's ticket. You couldn't physically intimidate voters to cast that ticket. There was little incentive to bribe and coerce voters on the day when you had no way of knowing how they'd voted when they were alone with their ballot. And there was little for the crowds to hang around and watch. I mean, bribery and coercion of voters by the party machine was still alive and well. It just took on different forms. But now, voters needed to be persuaded to vote for your party long before Election Day itself. In the 20th century, voters needed to be swayed with reason, with arguments, or with fear, and this would be done through the media, where political parties fought to control the message in the newspapers. Newspapers grew in importance during this period because voters cast their ballots at many different places throughout the city. Newspapers became the only place to learn about Election Day happenings from around the city. It was no longer possible to witness the entire voting population in one place, so the newspaper provided that space. Late 19th century newspapers grew less partisan, though many leaned one way or another. The Philadelphia Inquirer was reliably Republican. The Philadelphia Record leaned Democratic, while the reform-minded Public Ledger tried to remain neutral. Newspapers were now driven by ad revenue, so they catered to as broad a public as possible. To attract more readers, newspapers became more sensational. They began using big, bold, dramatic type. More than anything, the newspapers wanted a good story. And one way to get a good story was to create one yourself. Near the end of the 19th century, the large newspapers began to organize elaborate events on Election Day night. Voters would cast their ballots in their wards and then gather outside the newspaper offices that night to await election results. Here's Professor Bruin again.
It's the media now that starts to serve as this institution for bringing various folks together down physically into the center of the city. And they have these elaborately designed displays featuring modern electronic technology. They throw up pictures onto the sides of walls. And then the practical reason why everybody's down there is because the newspapers are getting in the returns from the rest of the country. So they're able to get the news out, who's ahead and who's behind. And you get crowds of people. Folks are selling things. There are parades going up and down the street.
Newspapers became the center of election night celebrations. Thousands came and blocked the main streets in Center City. This was where voters could still come out and see each other and have a bit of that Election Day holiday atmosphere. Let's pause here a minute because there was a lot of changes in voting in Philadelphia in the early 1900s. In these years, the number of Philly residents grew by 60% before peaking in 1950, though some parts of the city, like West Philadelphia, would triple in population. The people moving in were increasingly Eastern Europeans, Italians, and Black migrants from the South. The city was changing, and so was voting. First, in 1901, Pennsylvania adopted its first voter registration law in over 30 years. Only voters in cities like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh had to register, and we've had to register ever since. But from 1901 to 1937, Philadelphia voters had to renew their voter registration every year. In Philly, it's believed that this law reduced voter turnout to only 60 or 70% of eligible voters, and that number was likely lower in the poorer wards of the city. The state adopted a strategic uniform registry of electors in 1937, which ended this craziness. Another major change involved the election of U.S. senators. In 1913, the 17th Amendment was ratified. This amendment changed the way that U.S. senators were elected. Before that, U.S. senators were chosen by the state legislatures. And if you remember, the state legislatures were run by the corrupt party machines in the late 19th century. So now, U.S. senators would be chosen by popular vote. And last, immigration grew even more restrictive in the early 1900s. It became harder for immigrants from some countries to become naturalized citizens and be able to vote. There were strict immigration quotas in the 1920s and a de facto ban on Asian immigration. Immigrant numbers wouldn't increase until after the 1960s because of changes brought about by the civil rights movement. Of course, the biggest change to American voting came in 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. The political tides changed around 1915, when different groups began supporting women's rights to vote. National groups like the National American Women's Suffrage Association were joined by working-class organizations to support women having the vote. This included political machines like the Republican Party in Philadelphia and organized labor movements. Then the U.S. entered World War I, and as in every other war, women stepped up to support the war effort. Their hard work was recognized by the federal government, and President Woodrow Wilson publicly supported giving women the right to vote. It also helped that Election Day was no longer rough and rowdy and full of alcohol. Voting now took place indoors, typically in a civic building, behind a screen. You no longer needed to be a partisan warrior to cast your ballot, ready to fight for your party. Voting was now something done by serious-minded citizens. Professor Bruin explains.
So the frame for the voter switches from this kind of, be very frank, masculine sort of understanding of what the citizen's responsibility is on Election Day and what Election Day means. And the frame then switches to one in which you are, a citizen of the country, right? You don't have primary allegiance to any particular party or group. And so your responsibility is a more sober and rational one. Not to be a good Republican, but to be a good American.
Voting had changed, and it was now much easier for people to imagine women participating. Women first voted in Philadelphia in November 1920. It should have been a blowout. After a long, hard fight, half of the adult population went from not being able to vote to now being able to cast a ballot. But the truth is, it was kind of a bust. In 1920, overall, only 50% of eligible voters cast a ballot on Election Day. This was part of a growing trend of decreasing participation, which had peaked during the 1870s. But participation by women voters in 1920 was even worse. It's estimated that less than half of women who were now eligible to vote came out to the polls that year. However, one group of women registered to vote in large numbers in Philadelphia, and they remain one of the most reliable voting groups today: Black women. In 1920, the Philadelphia Tribune reported that 35,000 Black women had registered to vote, which was an impressive 25% of the total Black population. And they made a difference. With the support of women, the Black community voted to send 2 Black men to Harrisburg as representatives from Philadelphia that year. So while women voters overall didn't turn out in large numbers, Black women in Philly did show up at the polls and were able to amplify their community's vote in certain districts. There's one more voting reform that fundamentally changed the way we cast our ballots on Election Day: the voting machine. The problem was that those new state-printed ballots could be confusing. In some elections, there could be hundreds of names on a ballot. And tens of thousands of ballots were spoiled because people marked them incorrectly. Voters marked too many boxes or not enough, and ballots grew even more complicated. The response to the increasingly complex ballot was the voting machine. The voting machine was kind of an extension of the uniform state-printed ballot. It made the act of voting feel even more unbiased, more rational, less fraudulent. There were several patents for voting machines, but Philadelphia invested in machines made by the Shoup Corporation in Bryn Mawr. They were first used in the city in the 1930s. To use these machines, voters stood behind a curtain and cast their vote by turning a bunch of small levers to indicate their preferred candidates, and then pulling across a large red lever to vote. And these kinds of voting machines were still at work in the 1990s. At this point in our story of Election Day in Philadelphia, we have many of the pieces of modern voting in place. On a general election day, voters cast their ballots by stepping into a private space alone. Every voter receives the same state-printed ballot, and voters mark their ballots using some sort of voting machine. While there have been plenty of shenanigans to reduce the voting power of some groups, overall, the trajectory of voting rights has been to allow more citizens to vote. Asian Americans won the right to become naturalized citizens who could vote in the 1950s. The civil rights movement pushed for new voter protections and finally gave Native Americans the right to vote in the 1960s. In Philadelphia, the civil rights movement helped to mobilize the Black community and reshape Philly politics. This was especially notable when they organized against Mayor Frank Rizzo in 1978. Voters turned out decisively to vote against Rizzo's effort to rewrite the city's charter to allow him to run for a third term as mayor. Black leaders formed a coalition with white liberals and Puerto Rican voters, and they organized an impressive voter registration push. In the end, they worked together to elect the city's first Black mayor in 1983. But even though more people could vote, often fewer people did. Voter turnout remained relatively low throughout the 20th century. It hovered around 50 or 60% of eligible voters coming out to vote on Election Day. There were exceptions during the Depression years in the 1930s and the campaigns to elect Franklin D. Roosevelt. In Philly, this may have corresponded with the removal of tax payment requirements for voters in 1933. The tax requirement had been around for almost 100 years. But mostly, voter turnout was down from the peak in the 1870s, when on average, 75% of eligible men voted. For comparison, the 2020 presidential election had one of the highest voter turnout numbers in recent history at just 66%. Professor Bruin speculates that the reason for dropping voter turnout is complex, but part of the reason may be the decline in the public spectacle on Election Day. The newspapers who had hosted these events now had competition from the radio. Here's Professor Bruin.
Once you have radio, there's no reason to go downtown to get the returns. The radio's going to give it to you, right? And so it's not really necessary, that trip. So that's one thing that really, it does break up those downtown crowds.
The first radio broadcast of election results was in 1916, but radios really came into their own in the 1920s. By the 1930s, radios were now competing with newspapers to present election results to the public. Then the first televised election returns came out in 1948. Professor Bruin describes a report from the Inquirer that election day.
It was dramatic. They were like, nobody's downtown tonight. Once television arrived, they just immediately disappear almost. It's a pretty dramatic moment. And at that point, that public experience kind of gets lost.
Instead of gathering with others in the city streets on election night, people now watched other people cheer and dance in ballrooms and campaign headquarters. With the end of the newspaper spectaculars, there was no central place for people in the city to come out and see each other on Election Day. Voting was now a more sober, private affair that catered to the thoughtful, informed, independent voter. Many voters felt less welcome at the polls, and maybe they felt like they weren't informed enough to vote. There was no more celebration. Instead, voting was a civic duty. Election Day became a lot like any other, only you had to fit in one more thing into your busy schedule. Here's Professor Bruin.
Yeah, there's not a lot for the voter to do anymore. And quite frankly, for many people, it becomes less fun, right? Less interesting, maybe more responsible, but less compelling to many people.
And you have to wonder which voters found voting to be less compelling. These tended to be less well-to-do voters, those with less formal education. These were exactly the kind of people that reformers didn't want to be voting in the first place. But some historians are wondering if the humdrum election days of the 20th century will continue. What if voting in the 20th century was an anomaly? What if today's elections are changing and reverting back to earlier election day trends? Professor Bruin sees a few interesting echoes of the past.
And what's interesting, too, about the voting experience, of course, is that over the past 20 or 30 years, we've really gone back in a sense, right? Because certainly, like in 2020, because of COVID, and people were voting throughout the fall. So they weren't actually voting all at the same time in the way that they had, in the 20th century.
With much more lenient mail-in voting, there may be less emphasis on Election Day itself. Instead, we might have a voting season, which is much more like the extended period of voting in England in the 1600s. Another throwback to the past may be the return of partisan media and celebrations of elections. Impartial mainstream media is no longer the main source of information. We now consume media from online spaces that offer a return to a much more partisan politics, where the opposition is demonized. The stakes on Election Day feel bigger. There are bigger crowds, more energy, It feels like an event worth celebrating. And this is something that has happened since Professor Bruen wrote his book on Election Day in Philadelphia.
Essentially, I feel like it made sense when I was writing it to ask where the celebration went to. And it turns out, I think that it didn't really disappear, or at least didn't disappear for good. It was just gone for a while, right? And almost from the moment that my book was published, in part because the partisan divisions get a lot more severe, you start to see the return of a much more public celebration of the vote.
In 2020, there were the street parties outside the convention center where they were counting votes. There were the dancing mailboxes, which are now at the Smithsonian. There were voters in long lines at polls in Southwest Philly who were joined by Joy to the Polls and the Resistance Revival chorus, going viral, dancing to the cha-cha slide. Or maybe you live in one of those neighborhoods that still gets together to celebrate when your candidate wins an election. In many places in Philly, you don't have to leave your house to hear the election returns. When you hear the pots banging, the cars honking, the people cheering, either the Eagles just scored or your candidate just won. And we're still trying to figure out how the internet and social media are changing Election Day. But we know that the public is no longer just consuming elections through mainstream media in live televised events. The media landscape has fractured. You can watch, read, and listen to election information anywhere at any time. But maybe the biggest change is that smartphones allow us, the voter, to capture our own experience and share it online. Here's Professor Bruen.
If we think about the evolution of where the center of political life exists, right? 200 years ago, there was a physical space, a physical center that we gathered around together with. And then eventually that physical space sort of shifted to the media. And what we did is we gathered around the radio or we gathered around the television set. And with smartphones and social media, that idea of a center has really exploded. Either we could say there is no center anymore. It's all just these interlocking nodes tied together. Or the center is the individual, him or herself. I am my own sort of center of political life, and I use my media to sort of reach out and connect with other things and other people. And the center moves as I do.
So I ask you, the voting public, the new center of our changing Election Day, can we have an inclusive, accessible, and transparent Election Day, or maybe an election season, that still makes people feel engaged, where everyone wants to vote because it feels like they're doing something that's meaningful to their everyday lives? Does Election Day have to be boring? Can we make Election Day a celebration where people have space to voice their opinions respectfully, celebrate their citizenship, and marvel at the peaceful transfer of power? Can we gather without violence, without another January 6th? I hope so. Thank you for listening to the Found in Philadelphia podcast. If you enjoyed this mini-series about the history of Election Day in Philly, please get out there and vote. And please check out the podcast website at foundinphiladelphia.com. There's a companion blog for this series where you can learn more, see some period images, and find a list of my sources. I want to thank Professor Mark Bruen for his time and patience in creating these episodes. This episode was researched, written, hosted, and recorded by me, Lori Amend. Huge thanks to the team at The Wave who mixed this episode and provided sound engineering.